Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 107th deck and it's titled Upkeep Trigger Mill. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So, as always, before we get into everything, let's take a quick second to highlight some of our social media accounts, some ways you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. If none of these are your cup of tea, you can always, of course, just like the channel, subscribe. That does help out quite a bit. But if you're looking for a little bit extra, you can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, send us an email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com, or the most direct way that you could help support us is Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. Over there you get access to things like the deck lists a week early, access to a Discord channel where we brew up the decks and also play some of the games for the channel. You get a card sent to you every single week as a thank you for all of your support. And some of the most important ones, in my opinion, is you get the unedited gameplay videos, so you can hear the players talking and having fun with each other rather than my narration over top of it. And last but not least, you also get the guarantee from me that any cards you suggest to be turned into decks for this channel will be turned into decks at some point. I can't promise that for everybody. You are, of course, always welcome to submit any cards that you would like to see turned into decks, and I'm happy to take a look, but I can't promise they will be turned into decks for anyone but our patrons. And of course, we do have to shout out our 5 current patrons. We have William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Calvin Schmidt, Eric Way, and Jeff Winger. To the 5 of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And I think I've probably rambled quite enough at this point, so let's move into our random card of the week. This time, suggested to us by Doodle over on Patreon/Discord. And the card that he suggested to us is Paradox Haze. Now, Paradox Haze is 2 and a blue for an enchantment, aura, enchant player. At the beginning of enchanted player's first upkeep each turn, that player gets an additional upkeep step after this step. So, I wasn't quite sure what to do with this card when we first got it because there's a ton of upkeep cards, and eventually I decided that I wanted to keep the colors kind of slim. I didn't want this to turn into just like a generic good stuff kind of deck, so we stuck to 2 colors. And that led us to our commander, which is Taigam Sidisi's Hand. So Taigam Sidisi's Hand is 3 blue, black for a 3/4 human wizard. Skip your draw step, and at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. And pay a black, tap, exile X cards from your graveyard. Target creature gets -X/-X until the end of turn. So if we are doubling our upkeep with Paradox Haze, then we can make sure that we're technically drawing 2 cards every turn with Taigam, even though we're skipping our draw step. And we're looking at 6 total cards every single turn and filling up the graveyard at the same time. So that could be incredibly powerful, provided we can actually get that going. And it leads us into a couple of our major themes for this deck. The first of which we've kind of already hinted at, that is upkeep triggers. We do have some cards that care about triggering in the upkeep because we of course want to stick to the theme brought to us by our card of the week. So we have cards like Creeping Bloodsucker, which is 1 and a black for a 1/2 vampire. At the beginning of your upkeep, Creeping Bloodsucker deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. So we want to make sure that we're getting a ton of cards that care about triggering in our upkeep. So just in case we have 2, Creeping Bloodsucker now would do 2 damage to each opponent in our upkeep, and we would actually gain 6 because we gain life equal to the damage dealt this way. So Creeping Bloodsucker gets tremendously powerful if we have double the upkeep, which is probably why it's a $2.50 card, even though it was recently printed. Also being in Jumpstart doesn't quite help that, but a very cool card nonetheless, and a great example of our upkeep theme. And then our next theme is going to be Mill. Because Taigam puts so many cards into our graveyard, particularly if we have double the upkeep, we might as well take advantage of that and try to mill ourselves as much as possible. So to that end, we have something like Court of Cunning, which is 1 blue for an enchantment. When Court of Cunning enters the battlefield, you become the monarch. At the beginning of your upkeep, any number of target players each mill 2 cards. If you're the monarch, each of those players mills 10 cards instead. Notably, it does say any number of players, so we can choose ourselves with this, which we will most likely be choosing the entire table. If someone does have like a graveyard deck, we probably won't choose them, but it is relevant to note that we can pick ourselves because that is what we want to be doing most of the time, making sure that we can fill up our graveyard, which leads us into theme number 3, reanimation. If we're filling up our graveyard, we may as well make sure that we can get our creatures back from the graveyard when we need them. So Victimize is a great example of that, which is 2 and a black for a sorcery. Choose 2 target creature cards in your graveyard, sacrifice a creature. If you do, return the chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. This gives us the opportunity to sacrifice off one of our creatures and get back 2 from the graveyard. So if we have 2 massive creatures that we want to get back, or they have just abilities, maybe upkeep triggers that we want, we can make sure that we're getting them back at any time. And so with all of these combined, we're focusing on the upkeep, we're focusing on the mill, and we're focusing on the reanimation. We can put together a pretty strong deck that plays into all of these strategies very well. So those are our themes, and I think the next thing we're going to have to do is take a quick look at some key cards. These are the cards that synergize with what we're trying to do very well, and if they don't directly win us the game, some of them do. If they don't directly win us the game, though, we can make sure that they're at least pushing us toward a victory. So the first card, and one that does in fact win us the game, is Sir Conrad the Grim. So Sir Conrad the Grim is 3 black for a 5/4 legendary creature, human knight. Whenever another creature dies or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, Sir Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent, and 1 and a black, each player mills a card. Now, with all of the mill that we've been talking about so far, Sir Conrad the Grim becomes incredibly powerful because with something like Court of Cunning, if we mill 2 and each other opponent mills 2, that's 8 total cards going into the graveyard, assuming we're in a 4-player game, and there is a chance that all 8 of those cards are creatures, and then Sir Conrad triggers on every single one of them, doing 8 damage to each opponent. Now, that is unlikely, but it's not impossible. And if we're milling that much every single turn, possibly double with something like the Paradox Haze, then at that point, Sir Conrad the Grim very, very quickly kills pretty much everyone else at the table except for us because we don't take the damage. So Sir Conrad really plays into what we're trying to do and is a phenomenal card for this deck. Next up, in our key cards, we have Out of the Tombs, which is a card that I've never actually played before this deck, so I'm very interested to see how it works. But Out of the Tombs is 2 and a black for an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put 2 Eon counters on Out of the Tombs, then mill cards equal to the number of Eon counters on it, and if you would draw a card while your library has no cards in it, instead return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. If you can't, you lose the game. Now, I specifically went out of my way with this deck to not include cards like Laboratory Maniac or Thassa's Oracle because I didn't want us to win by milling. I wanted us to use mill as a way to get our win conditions, and I think Out of the Tombs is a great substitute for those cards because now, instead of winning the game when we draw a card, we're returning creatures from our graveyard to the battlefield, which is what we want to be doing anyway. It's also worth noting that it doesn't specify that we exile the creature after it's been returned, like some cards do. So if we can find a way to kill our own creatures, bring them back with Out of the Tombs, get their advantages, and then kill them again and kind of keep the train going, that's really what we want to be doing. And also worth noting that if we reanimate a creature with Out of the Tombs, that's also going to trigger Sir Conrad because a creature left our graveyard, doing 1 damage to each opponent. So Out of the Tombs, phenomenal, but honestly, it just makes Sir Conrad even better, which is what we want. And then finally, our last key card is going to be Dreamborn Muse. And Dreamborn Muse is 2 blue for a 2/2 spirit. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player puts the top X cards from his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is the number of cards in their hand. And the way that this is going to work for us is that if in our upkeep we are milling, say, 5, because we have 5 cards in our hand, we could be milling 10 with Paradox Haze. Each other opponent mills maybe 5, 6, 7. And if we have something like Sir Conrad, that is a ton of damage. That's putting creatures in our graveyard for Out of the Tombs. Dreamborn Muse is a phenomenal way to get a ton of cards into the graveyard very, very quickly, particularly if it's our graveyard. It does hit our opponents, which can be a little bit tricky because people don't tend to like getting milled, so it could draw a little bit of hate, but I do think it's worth the slot just because of how powerful it is in the deck. But those are our key cards, and the next thing we're going to do is take a look at some cool interactions in the deck, some cards that synergize very well together. And the first pair that I want to highlight are going to be Corpse Connoisseur and Razor Lash Transmigrant. So Corpse Connoisseur is 4 and a black for a 3/3 zombie wizard. When it comes into play, you may search your library for a creature card and put that card into your graveyard. If you do, shuffle your library, and it has Unearth for 3 and a black. So if we search our library for a creature, we could search for Razorlash Transmigrant, which is 2 mana for a 3/1 artifact creature zombie. Razorlash Transmigrant can't block, and we can pay 6 mana, return the Transmigrant from our graveyard to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. But this ability does cost 4 less to activate if an opponent controls 4 or more non-basic lands. So this is incredibly powerful for a couple of reasons. One, Corpse Connoisseur can just search for anything, really, which is great, but it can search for Razorlash Transmigrant to put it into the graveyard, and then the Transmigrant has an ability to specifically get itself out of the graveyard. And since we're playing Commander, there's a very good chance that there's at least one opponent at the table who has 4 or more non-basic lands, so that ability is really only going to cost us 2 mana. So once we've got that going, maybe the Transmigrant dies and we have to put it back into the graveyard, we just get it right back. If the Corpse Connoisseur is just kind of sitting around, we could unearth it, maybe get something else into our graveyard, but by being able to tutor up the Transmigrant and immediately start getting it back and using it to attack, all of a sudden it's a 4/2. It can get kind of out of hand very quickly if our opponents don't have great ways to deal with it. So that is cool interaction number 1. And cool interaction number 2 is going to be between Archaeomancer and Living Death. And both of these cards are phenomenal on their own, but I think where they really shine is together. Because if Archaeomancer, which is 2 blue for a 1/2 human wizard, that says when Archaeomancer enters the battlefield, return target instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. If Archaeomancer is in the graveyard when we cast a Living Death, and Living Death is 3 black for a sorcery, each player exiles all creature cards from his or her graveyard, then sacrifices all creatures he or she controls, then puts all cards they exiled this way onto the battlefield. So if Archaeomancer is in the graveyard, we cast Living Death, we take all of our creatures out of our graveyard, put them into play. The Archaeomancer comes into play and returns an instant or sorcery from our graveyard to our hand. Living Death, since it's now resolved, is in the graveyard, and we can actually get that back with Archaeomancer and be prepared to do it again. So as long as we have these 2 cards, neither of them gets exiled, we can technically continue to loop them, provided we only cast the Living Death after Archaeomancer has died. So that can be incredibly powerful as a way to continue cycling our cards in and out of the graveyard and make sure that we're always getting the cards that we want and the creatures in play that are going to benefit us the most. So that is it for our cool interactions this week. And of course, the next thing we're going to do is take a look at the price of the deck. And this week it came out to $88.62, with the most expensive card being Filth. And Filth is 3 and a black for a 2/2 incarnation. It has Swamp Walk, and as long as it's in your graveyard and you control a swamp, creatures you control have Swamp Walk. Considering how common it is for decks to have black in them, Swamp Walk is probably going to be pretty effective. And the nice thing about this is that it can be in our graveyard and still do what it needs to do, so we never have to actually cast it. We can just mill it, we can get it into our graveyard some other way, and still benefit from it. So it is an incredibly powerful card. However, it is an $8.96 card, so if you wanted to trim the price down from $88 closer to about $80 even, you could cut out Filth and replace it with something else. There are a ton of other graveyard cards that we weren't able to include, so definitely worth the thought there. But if you're looking for cards to increase the price of the deck, or just cards that didn't quite fit into our original budget, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. And the card that I'm going to suggest to you this week is going to be Sheoldred Whispering One. And Shieldred Whispering one is 5 black for a 6/6 Praetor. It's got Swamp Walk. At the beginning of your upkeep, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. And at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, that player sacrifices a creature. And to take out of the deck so that we can put Shieldred in, we're going to take out Indulgent Tormentor, which is 3 black for a 5/3 demon. It's got flying. At the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card unless target opponent sacrifices a creature or pays 3 life. Now, Shieldred is almost directly an upgrade to Indulgent Tormentor because Indulgent Tormentor, smaller body, yeah, it costs a little bit less, but it gives our opponents a choice, and we really don't want to give our opponents a choice because most of the time they're probably just going to either pay 3 life or let us draw a card, whereas with Shieldred, we can force them to sacrifice a creature and get a creature back out of our graveyard every turn, which is not only the equivalent of drawing a card, but depending on the creature itself, it could actually be worth more than drawing a card because that creature might actually draw us cards. So if you're looking for an upgrade for the deck, I would slot in Shieldred and probably take out the Tormentor, just because I think since we're reanimating our creatures, the mana value doesn't really make too much of a difference, and Shieldred is just significantly more powerful in the long run. But that brings us to the end of our deck tech, and the only thing we have left to do is take a look at how this deck performs in a game. So we are going to run this deck up against 3 opponents this week, and we are going to be playing against Bilal, playing Shanid, Sleeper Scourge, Shawn, playing Giada, Font of Hope, and McRae, playing Garth, One Eye. So starting with Bilal, the Shanid deck is just a legendary matters deck. He wants to play as many legendary spells and legendary lands as possible, so that way he can draw a ton of cards, hopefully, from our point of view, lose a bunch of life, and eventually kind of run people over with the legends. So I am very concerned about this deck. I've actually lost to this deck before, and I think Shanid is kind of a sleeper, no pun intended, in terms of power because of how strong legendaries are in the Mardu colors. So I am very concerned about this one, but I'm hoping that the life loss kind of plays into our favor, but we'll have to see. Next up, we have Shawn playing Giada, and this is just an angel deck, very similar to Shanid in the sense that I have lost to this deck before. It is very powerful and very quick. Shawn is able to get a ton of angels down very, very quickly, so I do worry a little bit about that, especially because most of our creatures don't fly, so that is something to be a little bit worried about. And then finally, we have McRae playing their Garth One Eye deck, and this is a 5-color snow deck, so they want to make sure that they're playing as many snow permanents as possible, maybe some snow sorceries, things like that. So I am really unsure of what to expect. I don't think I've ever played against a Garth deck or a 5-color snow deck, so I'm very excited to see that. But hopefully, you all are as excited as I am for the game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Bilal, Shawn, and McRae. On my first turn, I play a Choked Estuary. Bilal plays a Temple of Malice, scrying 1. Shawn plays a Path of Ancestry. McRae plays a Polluted Delta, sacrificing it to search their library for a Rimewood Falls, putting it into play tapped. I play an island and cast Arcane Signet. Bilal plays a Temple of Silence, scrying 1. Shawn plays a Plains and casts his commander Giada, letting his other angels enter with a +1/+1 counter for each other angel he controls. McRae plays a Swamp and casts Cold Steel Heart, naming white so that it taps for white mana. I play an island and cast Razor Lash Transmigrant, and then also cast Search for Azcanta, letting me surveil 1 in my upkeep. Bilal plays a Temple of Triumph, scrying 1. Shawn plays a Plains and casts Righteous Valkyrie, which comes in with a +1/+1 counter, lets him gain life equal to the toughness of any angel or cleric that enters under his control, and also gives his creatures +2/+2 as long as he has 47 or more life. McRae plays an island and casts Icebind Pillar, which can be activated to tap an artifact or creature, and they also cast an Expedition map. In my upkeep, I surveil 1 with Search for Azcanta, putting Creeping Bloodsucker into the graveyard, then I play a Tainted Isle, and cast Court of Cunning, becoming the Monarch, and then in my upkeep, milling each player for 2, or if I'm still the Monarch, each player would mill 10. After that I move to combat and attack Bilal for 3. Bilal plays a Care Keep and casts his commander Shawn'd, Sleeper's Scourge, giving his legendary creatures menace and letting him draw a card and lose a life whenever he plays a legendary spell or land. Shawn plays a Plains and casts Dawn of Hope, letting him pay 2 mana whenever he gains life to draw a card, and pay 4 mana to make a 1/1 soldier token. He then moves to combat and attacks me for 2 with Giada, becoming the Monarch. McRae sacrifices the expedition map to search their library for a land, in this case an Alpine Meadow, putting it to hand and then playing it for turn. They also cast an Exploration, letting them play an additional land each turn, but unfortunately they don't have an extra one to play this turn. In my upkeep, each player mills 2, and then I surveil 1. Notably, in this process, I mill Wonder, giving all my creatures flying as long as I control an island, which, fortunately, I do. I then move straight to combat and attack Shawn for 3, but he blocks with Righteous Valkyrie, killing my Transmigrant. Then in my second main phase, I cast Paradox Haze, enchanting myself, giving myself 2 upkeeps every turn. Bilal plays Sokenzan, Crucible of Defiance, triggering Shawn'd, drawing a card and losing a life. Then he also casts Ravo Soultender, drawing a card, losing a life, giving his other creatures +1/+1, and returning a creature from his graveyard to his hand in his upkeep. Shawn plays a Plains and casts Inspiring Overseer, putting 2 +1/+1 counters on it, drawing a card, gaining 4 life, and paying 2 mana to draw another card. McRae casts their commander Garth One-Eye, and in response, I activate Razorlash Transmigrant's ability, returning it from my graveyard to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. Then in my upkeep, everyone mills 2 and I surveil 1, and the Paradox Haze gives me another upkeep, so we all mill 2 again, and I surveil 1 again, this time transforming Search for Azcanta into Azcanta the Sunken Ruin. Then I recast my commander Taigam Sidisi's hand, letting me look at the top 3 cards of my library in my upkeep, putting 1 into my hand and the other 2 into my graveyard, and also allowing me to exile X cards from my graveyard to give another creature -X/-X until the end of turn. I move to combat and attack McRae for 4. In Bilal's upkeep, he returns Liesa, Forgotten Archangel from his graveyard to his hand, plays a Takanuma, Abandoned Mire, drawing a card and losing a life, then casts Liesa, Forgotten Archangel, exiling any of his opponent's creatures that die, while returning any of his creatures that die to his hand at the beginning of the next end step, also drawing him a card and losing a life. Shawn plays a Plains and casts Angelic Skirmisher, entering with 3 +1/+1 counters, gaining 7 life, and letting him choose First Strike, Vigilance, or Lifelink at the beginning of each combat, giving the chosen ability to all of his creatures until the end of turn. When he moves to combat, he gives his team First Strike and then attacks me for 9 total damage. Notably, the Righteous Valkyrie should be giving his team an additional +2/+2 at this point, but we all completely forget about that. McRae casts an Amulet of Vigor, letting them untap any permanents that enter the battlefield, then also activates Garth, creating a Black Lotus token. After that, they cast Abominable Treefolk, which has power and toughness equal to the number of snow permanents they control, which is currently 7, and this also taps Shawn's Angelic Skirmisher, preventing it from untapping on his next untap step. In my upkeep, each player mills 2, while I look at the top 3 cards of my library, putting 1 into my hand and the other 2 into my graveyard. Then we repeat this process since I get an additional upkeep. After that, I play an island and attack Shawn for 4, reclaiming the monarchy. Then in my second main phase, I cast Victimize, sacrificing the Transmigrant, which unfortunately gets exiled by Liesa, to return 2 creatures from my graveyard to the battlefield. This lets me get Sir Conrad the Grim, which does 1 damage to each opponent whenever a creature goes to the graveyard from anywhere, or whenever a creature leaves my graveyard, and I also get Dreamborn Muse, milling each player for X in their upkeep, where X is the number of cards in their hand. In Bilal's upkeep, he mills 7 cards, including 6 creatures, so each of my opponents takes 6 damage. Then he also returns Rograk, son of Roga, from his graveyard to his hand, letting him cast it, drawing a card and losing a life. He also casts Kelsine the Plague, which can tap to do 1 damage to a creature and gives Bilal an experience counter if that creature dies this turn. This also draws him a card and loses him a life. After that, he casts a Soul Ring and plays Untai Dake the Cloudkeeper, losing a life and drawing another card. After that, he casts Odric Lunarch Marshal, giving all his creatures the keywords of any other creature he controls at the beginning of each combat. This also draws him a card and makes him lose yet another life. When he moves to combat, all of his creatures get Vigilance, Haste, Flying, Menace, Lifelink, First Strike, and Trample. This lets him attack me for 5, Shawn for 3, and McRae for 4, gaining Bilal a total of 11 life. In Shawn's upkeep, he mills 7 cards, including 4 creatures, so each of my opponents takes 4 damage. Then he casts an Emeria Shepherd, letting him return a creature from his graveyard to his hand when he plays a land, or return it to the battlefield if that land is a Plains. This enters with 4+1/+1 counters and gains him 8 life. Then he plays a Plains, returning Karmic Guide from his graveyard to the battlefield, entering with 5+1/+1 counters and gaining Shawn 7 life, while also returning Enduring Angel from his graveyard to the battlefield, giving himself hexproof, putting 6 counters on it and gaining 9 life. Moving to combat, Shawn gives his team First Strike and then attacks me for 9. In McRae's upkeep, they mill 4 cards, hitting no creatures. Then they cast Skred, doing 8 damage to Sir Conrad since McRae controls 8 snow permanents, killing Sir Conrad. In response, I cast Swift End, destroying Bilal's Liesa and losing 2 life. This doesn't save my Conrad, but it does let him go to the graveyard instead of getting exiled. Still before Conrad dies, Bilal taps Kelsine, doing 1 damage to Conrad so that Bilal gets an experience counter when he dies. Once all of that has resolved, McRae activates Garth to cast Brain Geyser for X = 5, drawing 5 cards, then plays a mountain and passes. In my upkeep, I mill 5, everyone except Shawn mills 2, and then I look at the top 3 cards of my library, putting 1 into my hand and the others into my graveyard. Then, thanks to Paradox Haze, I repeat this process again in my second upkeep. After that, I play a Swamp, and then cast Midnight Clock, which gets an hour counter each upkeep. I also cast a Cephalid Vandal, which gets a Shred counter in my upkeep, and then I mill equal to the number of Shred counters on it. In Bilal's upkeep, he mills 7, then returns Liesa from his graveyard to his hand. He plays Shizo, Death's Storehouse, drawing a card, losing a life, and then recasts Liesa, drawing a card and losing another life. He also casts Karlach, Fury of Avernus, letting him gain an additional combat step whenever he attacks for the first time each turn, drawing a card and losing another life. Before combat, McRae activates Icebind Pillar to tap Liesa, and in response to that, I tap Taigam, exiling 5 cards from my graveyard to give Karlach -5/-5 until the end of turn, killing it. Then Bilal moves to combat, giving all his creatures the keywords of all his other creatures, and attacks me for 13 total damage. I block 3 of it with both of my creatures, exiling them and taking 10, going down to just 2 life, while Bilal gains 13. In Shawn's upkeep, he doesn't pay the Echo cost for Karmic Guide, letting it get exiled. Then he casts Sarah's Emissary, giving all his creatures and himself protection from creatures. In response, McRae casts Frostbite, killing Giada. However, Shawn has an answer, countering the spell with Rebuff the Wicked. This lets the Emissary enter with 6+1/+1 counters and gains Shawn 13 life. When he moves to combat, Shawn gives all of his creatures Vigilance and then attacks me for 4, McRae for 22, and Bilal for 7, knocking McRae and I out of the game. Unfortunately for Shawn though, on Bilal's turn, he's able to cast Insurrection, gaining control of all the creatures in play, allowing him to attack Shawn for a total of 76 damage, knocking Shawn out with his own creatures and winning Bilal the game. All right, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot of back and forth. There were a few times when it looked like we might win it, when Shawn might win it. McRae, unfortunately, never really quite got off the ground, but a big congratulations to Bilal for winning the game. I think the insurrection is definitely what caused him to win there. I don't think he would have had the power to outlast Shawn in the long run if it weren't for that. So, very timely card to have. Overall, I think all the decks did very well. Like I said, McRae kind of struggled with lands a bit, so they weren't able to take advantage of their cards. Our deck did very well, and I think that if we'd kept Sir Conrad for one more turn around the table, we probably just could have started knocking people out, which is very cool. Shawn, I think, definitely deserved the win there. Unfortunately, very early on in the game, we should have been factoring in the Righteous Valkyries +2/+2, but it didn't get factored in at any point throughout the course of the game, which means that had it been noticed by the end of it, he could have actually knocked Bilal out of the game instead of me and McRae, leading him to most likely kind of clean us up the turn later, but unfortunately, not quite how it turned out. So a very cool showing by everybody. I hope you all enjoyed the game. I definitely did. And let me know what you think about it down in the comments. Let me know if you have any suggestions for future cards you would like to see turned into videos. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.